They call themselves Anonymous. They are hackers on steroids, treating the web like a real-life video game.
A notorious hacker group is targeting Denver over its homeless camp.
Someone has broken into the National Bank, the Federal Reserve.
The hacking group Anonymous is threatening Donald Trump.
We are Anonymous. We are Legion. We do not forgive. Expect us.
When you think of what it is to be a hacker, what comes to mind? If you're in the field, you might have an image in your mind about hacking a box and getting a shell on the target. If you're not in the field, however, then that word hacker might evoke an image of a mask. And where does that mask come from? This mask has taken on a life of its own in many ways. This mask has gone from being an iconic image of a classic movie,
remember the 5th of November,
to representing a movement and a hacker group that a lot of people completely misunderstand and at the same time has been at the center of a lot of controversy. We're going to talk about Anonymous. This hacker group, if you can really call it a group, has existed for almost 20 years now, and it might be one of the most important cyber threat groups at this point in history. Whether you agree with their ideals or not, whether you agree with their methods or not, you really can't deny the important role that they've played in shaping not only culture but also the cybersecurity industry as a whole. They've made some of the biggest and most grand public statements, followed up with some very high profile and really high visibility cyber attacks. But are those cyber attacks really all that they're cut out to be? They've been hailed as heroes by some, and they've been called terrorists by others. Before we go much further, I want to first acknowledge something about Anonymous that is a very key component, and that is I'm going to be calling them a group. However, it's really difficult to really describe them as a group. They're not very similar to other threat groups out there where they have a central decision-making structure, they have memberships, and they have a really straightforward way to not only identify their members but identify imposters. This is really a collective bound by ideals and the concept of anonymity. We're going to talk about how that has impacted the group and its public perception in a moment. But when we talk about a lot of these actions that they've performed in the past, think of it as acting kind of similar to a hive of bees and not so much a pack of wolves where, the wolves are really moving in sync with an alpha. All that being said, let's start from the beginning.
The Patriots stunned everybody by successfully running into the teeth of the Titans' vaunted defensive front.
It's 2003 and a number of users on 4chan, yes that 4chan, are posting comments utilizing a feature on the service that allows them to post as anonymous users. Whenever they're not logged into an account, they are given a tag of anonymous, and this is really the birthplace of what formed the anonymous identity. As commenters began to comment en masse under the anonymous identity, they really started to form a collective identity. They called themselves Anons. This took a life of its own, and the users would eventually start to raid other forums within 4chan. They would raid other things off of 4chan, and this went on for a number of years. And you can think of these raids as practically denial of service attacks. They're not necessarily going after server infrastructure, but they're really denying service to viewers of the forum by simply flooding it with irrelevant or infectious comments, aka a ton of trolling. The trolling and harassment really went on until about 2008, whenever Anonymous really started their first foray into targeting an organization at scale. And I know I just used the term hacktivism, but I'm not going to use this term any further, and that's really for a specific reason. That is that it is not really legal. It's not legal at all. And I don't want you watching this video to think that it's okay to do these kinds of actions that Anonymous is doing. Simply put, if you don't have permission to attack a target, then it's illegal. And people learn this lesson as part of the story, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. But in what was called Project Chronology, Anonymous went after the Church of Scientology. This happened after the church really went after Gawker for publishing a story about the Church of Scientology. They did everything from harassing the organization by basically trying to drain the organization of their printer ink, by basically faxing them all black pages and forcing it to just print with all of its ink, to launching denial of service attacks of its web infrastructure. This is where we see them start to utilize low orbit ion cannon, which is a very popular network stress testing tool tool that has since been used a lot by users in denial of service attacks. But this is also where a lot of low-level users started to get into trouble with law enforcement and arrested because they either didn't know how to hide their IP address, or they were told by other anonymous members that this had no legal consequences. Again, something that is completely false. But as well as doing these kinds of attacks, they also organized and sent forth large in-person protests. It's not too long after this happened that WikiLeaks enters the picture. When WikiLeaks started to publish classified content online, Anonymous started to support the organization. They went after a number of web-based banking platforms like PayPal, as well as credit card companies who had severed ties with the website, especially after the website started publishing classified content. This obviously wasn't their first foray into the political scene, but it was certainly them drawing a line in the sand and kind of implying a lot of the ethics that the organization stood for. They would follow this in 2011 and 2012 by supporting the Arab Spring movement in the Middle East and North Africa. What started in Tunisia and spread throughout the region, Anonymous supported protesters who were seeking to overturn their authoritarian regimes, and they did so by launching distributed denial of service attacks and other kinds of pretty low-grade cyber attacks like, denial of service, but also website defacements, and then also helping organizers of protests to get their messages across and communicate in a secure fashion. They also supported social protest movements inside the United States and other Western countries by targeting, like, say, the Westboro Baptist Church and the KKK. They also supported the Occupy Wall Street movement. And similar to Arab Spring, they supported these movements with distributed denial of service attacks, website defacements, and organizing large protests. There was some disagreement within Anonymous, it seems, on the support levels for Occupy Wall Street. However, regardless, I'm noting that as an action that Anonymous sponsored because, well, they did. In 2014, Anonymous would target local law enforcement and city utilities in Ferguson, Missouri, following the murder of Michael Brown. Again, this would be everything from distributed denial of service attacks to disabling Wi-Fi in certain areas to unmasking members of the KKK. Following this, they also went after ISIS and Al-Qaeda following the murder of Charlie Hebdo in Paris. And then that takes us to 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. And then this is where they kind of changed tactics a little bit. To this point, their attacks have really been fairly low grade. Again, denial of service attacks really don't take a lot of effort. They don't really have a significant impact on infrastructure other than degrading its ability to service customers. However, once the attack is over, the infrastructure pops right back up. With website defacements, again, you're not really leaking data or destroying anything. It's just a defacement. You can revert back to a previous image and have the website back to its previous form. However, in 2020, following the murder of George Floyd, Anonymous would do these things against local law enforcement, but then they also targeted a partner organization and leaked over 200 gigabytes of data about local law enforcement that had everything from reports to intelligence and even emails. And then finally, that takes us to the present day, where right now Anonymous is engaged in cyber attacks against Russia as a result of their invasion of Ukraine. And again, this includes their previous suite of distributed denial of service attacks and website defacements, but it also includes the leaking of data and the denial of digital infrastructure. And they've targeted everything from the Russian government to organizations that exist in Russia. As a whole, Anonymous has shown that they're not really a similar organization to other threat groups that has any kind of central cohesion or structure. The general opinion is somewhere between anarchy and really just a close eye on governments and zero tolerance for any perceived wrongdoing. While some have related Anonymous to being the modern day digital Robin Hood, others have related them to cyber terrorists. At the same time, many Anonymous members have been arrested throughout this time. Many for being low skilled and not really being able to hide themselves online, and others for being completely duped by Anonymous members into believing that their actions online had zero consequences. Furthermore, Anonymous has created some division as to their motives. Again, while we can all agree that an organization like ISIS stinks, targeting law enforcement certainly has caused much more division. And I'm not here advocating for either side. I'm just trying to report kind of historically what things have been like. In many cases, their persona has been overstated. In many other cases, it's been forgotten. And again, one of the first videos we talked about on this channel was on cybersecurity ethics. While many people have advocated for hacktivism and hacking for a purpose that may not necessarily be legal, the law is pretty clear. If you don't have express written permission to attack a target, then it's probably illegal. So in either case, it's important to know where the law stands when it comes to hacking. Another element that's forgotten about in terms of Anonymous is how, due to its decentralized and disorganized structure, it can be very easy for infiltrators to get into the organization or pose as imposters. And this can either tarnish the image of Anonymous, or it could sway the organization into performing different actions. Well, hacking ISIS really benefits everybody because everybody hates ISIS. Hacking US government agencies certainly benefits a few. And the same can be said about hacking Russian agencies. Contrast this with a threat group that has strict control over its membership that can really easily point out imposters and publicly condemn them and identify and take responsibility for certain actions. Anonymous doesn't necessarily have that luxury because, again, that would violate the terms of being anonymous. This has gotten a lot of people into trouble for trying to act in a way that would support the group, but they don't necessarily have the expertise or support from other members, and so they go out and get themselves in trouble. You may see cases online where an account that looks like it's affiliated with Anonymous will make some crazy grand statements about a massive cyber attack that they're about to launch, and then either nothing happens or things just fail to materialize. Generally, some things to keep in mind with what we've seen historically of anonymous attacks is you'll see a combination of the following. You might see a social media campaign to raise awareness about the issues on why they're hacking a particular group, and they may be using those campaigns to organize in-person protests. Obviously, in cases like where they were hacking ISIS or now with Russia, that may not necessarily be the case because, again, who are they going to protest to? It's a war zone. But in other cases, they have organized protests. They may launch distributed denial of service attacks, and they might also launch website defacements with some sort of messaging that mirrors previous anonymous attacks. And this is another case where it can be hard to spot at times because other threat groups will try to use kind of knockoff language to gain attention. But lately, as in the past few years, we've seen Anonymous leak data as part of their campaigns as well, as happened with law enforcement in 2020 and with Russia today. Simply put, these low-grade cyber attacks like website defacements and distributed denial of service attacks don't necessarily do any real damage. They're really all just for show. Anyone can fire a low-orbit ion cannon on their computer and get arrested. But the data leaks is where the technical skill really comes in. Whether you like them or not, whether you agree with them or not, Anonymous has had a huge impact on the cybersecurity industry as a whole. Many people have gotten into the industry to become ethical hackers inspired by the anonymous message and iconography, for better or for worse. To get somebody else's opinion on this, I asked The Raven. He's one of the founders of the Republic of Hackers Discord. You can join that down in the video description. He's been in the industry for a number of years and now he works as an ethical hacker. I wanted to get his thoughts on this and here's what he had to say.
I mean, from their origins, from trolling and organizing raids on 4chan to disrupting services in Russia, Anonymous has had the presence in the cybersecurity space for approximately 20 years, about 2 decades. They coordinate and launch campaigns against, governments, corporations, religious organizations like Scientology, who they feel contrast the group's values. The hacktivist group has not only influenced opinions on leaders, but Hollywood writers, inspired other hacker groups like, let's say, LulzSec. Generally, Anonymous aligns to the anarchist political ideology and encourages decentralization of power and equality for all. They really don't have one set leader or, set governing body. It's just, full decentralization. Yeah, they've targeted a long list of parties, the record industry, motion picture industry, Department of Justice in the US, the FBI, Russia, PayPal, after the online payments platform stopped allowing donations to WikiLeaks, the whole Julian Assange thing as well, Tunisia, Egypt. They've been all over the place. Actually, in 2012, Anonymous was named one of the world's most influential people in time.
20 years is a long time, especially on the internet. It's definitely something to, kind of look at and really kind of consider the implications, not only from a security standpoint, but really from a societal standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Socio-political activism became prominent in the 50s and 60s. Think the Vietnam War and all of the things leading up to that with black rights in the United States and Dr. Martin Luther King, all of that, and spurred this socio-political activism. You give enough people cause to speak and groups will form. You give people more technologies to speak their message and they're going to utilize it. Take Anonymous out of the question. Like how you've posed the question, what happens if Anonymous never existed? There will always be outliers and outcasts in our society. With the cover of anonymity, I feel that groups like Anonymous will always exist. Add technology, a reason to speak in anonymity to anything, and the world is your oyster. So to answer the question, no matter how you look at it, groups like Anonymous will always form. Anonymous is put on a pedestal by the media, and I don't think they should be. To bring a very stark, drastic comparison, think of it this way, with the recent shootings in Buffalo and, what they're saying, it's race driven or whatever's being driven that way, would there be as many cause-driven mass murders in the world if media didn't glorify the atrocities? So compare that to Anonymous, and Hollywood talks about Anonymous, and the media is always talking about Anonymous, and Anonymous talks about Anonymous on Twitter and on Instagram and all of those channels. If the media was removed from the equation, I think that we would see a stark, drastic difference from what it looks today. So expanding on the question, like what would the industry look like if groups such as Anonymous didn't exist? For this case, let's say we had 0 APT groups out there. We would see less cybersecurity professionals, less system administrators, no MITRE attack framework, no cyber resiliency, and like a cyber utopia. I probably wouldn't have my job. You probably wouldn't be broadcasting your news. So to say it that way, I mean, it would be an absolute utopia of the cyber world.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like an interesting concept is cyber utopia, because it's so easily broken. It really only takes one bad apple for that, that I guess perfect picture to be completely tarnished, But I really like your point about copycats and the production of copycats. I think that's such a valid point, especially in the hacking space and definitely within Anonymous, where it's so easy to kind of integrate yourself, even as like a low grade, hacktivist, to kind of claim membership of Anonymous, and there's no way to verify whether or not you are in fact a member of Anonymous. Like the very basis of anonymity is anonymity, right? So it's like, who's to say? And a lot of people do get in trouble with that.
I think to date, there's been 15 arrests for Anonymous and people claiming that they are part of Anonymous, bragging about it. If they are or they aren't, we have no proof, because I mean, there's all speculation at this point. Who is Anonymous? Who's part of Anonymous? Who's tied to Anonymous? Lots of Discord channels out there and servers out there claim that they're, some members are Anonymous, or some people go out on Twitter and they're like, yeah, I'm so-and-so and I was an Anonymous, but I'm retired. Well, statute of limitations probably don't apply at this case, because they've done some serious damage to governments, Scientology, for instance. Not that I'm going to argue one way or the other on Scientology, but, they've gone after people financially. Why wouldn't they go after, the certain people that are claiming they have had ties to Anonymous?
Thank you to the Raven for being down to sit down with me and share his thoughts on this. You can hang out with him and a number of the other excellent folks on Republic of Hackers, again, using the link down in the video description. But I want to hear what you have to say about Anonymous and what impact you think that Anonymous has had on the cybersecurity industry as a whole. So comment that down below after liking this video, so this video can be pushed out to new audiences. And if this video was helpful, be sure to share it as well. I really appreciate it. And with all that, I'll see you all next time. Bye.